Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Follow the stories we're talking about at breakpoint.org, where you'll find commentary every day and resources to help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. And I really want to emphasize that call to breakpoint.org, because I think this was one of our best weeks of commentaries in quite some time. We hit big worldview topics like sexuality and human rights abuses, and entertainment and disabilities and the image of God and prayer and abortion and all of this in connection, John, with current stories. And I'll just say my family learns from this stuff as we listen. And I say that as someone who actually contributes to it. So I learned writing this stuff. Chuck believed in Breakpoint, and I think it's probably one of the most important things we do and most timely things we do. And speaking of timely, of course, as we record this, we're about to roll into the anniversary here of September 11th, which was almost 20 years ago. It's incredible. It's incredibly hard to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, there's at least a couple things to mention. First of all, is most of the teenagers in your life, almost all of them now, because it's been 19 years, were born without a memory of 9/11. I realized that with my own kids on the 10th anniversary. I think my oldest at the time was probably 7 or 8, and it was interesting because, again, it was the 10th anniversary. I had gone through 9 other ones before then, pretty unemotionally. I mean, obviously the day of was extremely emotional, and then how I dealt with the classes that I was teaching at the time and friends and family and so on, and just processing it like everybody else. But it was the 10th anniversary that hit me. And I think it was because I realized just how different a world was after 9/11 than before, especially for my kids. I remember sitting in class as a college, probably sophomore. So this would have been 95, 96 and, 94, 95, I guess. And thinking to myself, I think it was a history of Western Civ class, Shane. We were talking about the World War I or World War II, or just the 20th century of chaos. And then thinking, well, that's over. I can't imagine that we'd ever be dumb enough to go back to war as an entire planet again. And then 2001, I remember 2 years after that, asking my class that I was teaching at the time and asking, can you guys imagine the world being at peace again? And their answer was, of course, no. But just being a dad and just realizing that my kids are raised in a post 9/11 world, it's really something. The other thing, though, that occurred to me this week, Shane, there's a remarkable quote. I think it's Alexander Toynbee, if I remember right, one of the Scottish historians, who says that, cultures don't get murdered, they commit suicide. And cultures do a lot better at handling attacks from without than they do from the kind of the long treachery towards, breakdown within. Are we seeing that kind of right now? Is our culture having a much harder time dealing with the internal fissures and fractures and divisions and pointlessness and false hopes and dreams than handling something as dramatic as an outside attack?
It's something you hear in the background a lot, John, and that's what fascinates me, because my generation came of age in the shadow of September 11th and you might say the footprint of those towers that fell, and then the war on terror that unfolded after that, and especially the war in Iraq and that particular manifestation of it. And I often hear, in the laundry list of complaints that members of my generation give about previous administrations, about the previous generation, about people who they saw as their parents and the man, that endless wars in the Middle East, pointless endless wars in the Middle East, is one of the top things that ended up shaping and turning their social consciousness in a particular direction, an anti-authoritarian direction. So I think that is a lot of what forms the background of the social unrest that we're seeing today. Even though it has nothing to do with wars overseas, it's more like a war right here in our own streets, with these violent riots and looting and so forth. But I think it does form a big part of the social consciousness. And September 11th casts a very long shadow, even where it's not really mentioned.
Yeah, well, and then you have the problem too of who's telling the history and who's telling the story, right? I mean, everyone's certainty, for example, that Iraq was a bad decision and they didn't have weapons of mass destruction and those decisions were poor. Everyone was absolutely certain when the decisions were made, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you
this
need
was
only
not
watch the reels of everyone from every party saying that,
John Kerry, Joe Biden,
right, they
Hillary
all
Clinton.
agreed.
It just, no, it was. And so, but it's important to note too that your generation does remember that. The next generation won't. I remember one of our Colson Fellows cohorts here in Colorado Springs, led by my wife, so it's my favorite. They had a conversation last year, and two of the millennial students there mentioned, the idea of capitalism versus socialism, and their take was, look, our earliest memory is, the market crash in 2008, the real estate bust, all of that sort of stuff. So for us, capitalism didn't have a great reputation, had a bad reputation. And by the way, the church never talked about it. So the only source of information that we had came from school, and it came from media. And so what kind of education is. Why, it's kind of why is the younger generation more drawn to socialism? Well, there you go. I mean, you don't have any sort of real historical memory of fighting the enemy, and the enemy being socialism and being different than us, and we're free and we're better, and so on. And I think we're also can expect something like that around 9/11 as how do we actually then build this historical memory into the emerging generation of what will a generation look like that lacks that historical memory. I mean, first of all, we're a culture that devalues historical memory anyway, right? We are the definition of C.S. Lewis's chronological snobbery, that somehow we're more just. We would have made better decisions. We wouldn't have gone into Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. We wouldn't have this, that, or the other. The institutional distrust here is at a really significant high. And has moved from, the skepticism or the disdain for the military in the 70s to, to the police now. I mean, this is a long, what is it? Slouching Towards Gomorrah was the title of one of those books, but it is a time. Days like today are good memorials to stop and think back, because without a historical memory, we don't have a whole lot to go on.
And that raises the question for me, John, of what the shaping events of this next generation are going to be, of my kids' generation. Because not that Islamic terrorism is no longer an issue; it's still a huge issue. And I think Islamic persecution of minorities, especially Christians, religious minorities, is a big deal. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But I think a prime candidate is going to be the political shakeup and changes in China, particularly the crackdown on provinces like Hong Kong, or on religious and ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs, and of course on the persecuted church there in China. We had a story that we hit on Breakpoint earlier this week about exactly that, and it had to do, interestingly enough, with a movie that my generation grew up with from Disney about China. And it was the old cartoon was Mulan, of course, and we know Eddie Murphy's Talking Dragon and all that good stuff. But this new live action remake, in the new Disney tradition of remaking the old cartoons, was filmed predominantly in China. Many of the sweeping landscapes and vistas were there. And we learned something about that this week, that much of the movie was filmed in Xinjiang province, which is where the genocide, and yes, we can use the word genocide, against the Uyghur Muslim minority there is taking place. And there's a backlash building against Disney for precisely this, not just because they filmed there, John, but because they openly worked with government departments that are perpetrating that genocide, and actually thanked them in the credits of the movie itself. So it's kind of a PR job for the worst aspects of communist China.
These live action remakes have been really excellently done. That's what they're such amazing movies, starting with Cinderella and even before and all of that. This was a really remarkable development. Although my daughter said that, Eddie Murphy's dragon character, is it Mushu? Is that the name? Like,
yes.
He's not in this one because it's offensive. Right. So they were like, I'm not, the movie's no good without the dragons. So anyway, they weren't excited about it anyway. But
if Eddie Murphy's not some kind of talking animal, I'm not interested.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's it was a pretty central character before. But look, this is the same Disney that said they couldn't work in Georgia because of
Right.
laws having to do with abortion, or even just, and this is a little bit before the most recent abortion restrictions there, but religious liberty protections in the wake of same-sex marriage. This is the same Disney. This is the same Disney that's part of the Hollywood community that loves to virtue signal, which is a word that I just hate, but I don't know what else do you call it
Yeah, me
when they
too.
throw out their support of the causes that are popular,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, turn around and work hand in hand. And they even thank these organizations in the credits that are involved in this sort of genocidal work. And I owe this observation to a National Review podcast that I was listening to this past week. Disney's the one taking the shots, and they should, right? But when was the last time you saw any movie out of Hollywood that treated China as the bad guy? We have all kinds of movies that treat Russia as the bad guy. One of the
Stranger Things is still in the middle of the Russia as the bad guy plot.
That's at least historically valid, because they were the 80s, right? But you go to there's a set of movies, I guess I haven't seen any of them, but they have to do with like the capitals of major nations falling. Like I think one's called Olympus Has Fallen or something, and it's about the White House being overtaken, right? And so on. You know who the bad guys are in that one? North Korea. As if North Korea had any chance whatsoever of getting across the border and establishing weapons and taking the White House hostage. It's insane. It's absolutely crazy. Who is the biggest geopolitical threat across the board? Who's the biggest perpetrator of human rights abuses, at least on the scale? There's 1 million Uyghurs right now in concentration camps. And not only that, they're being forcibly sterilized. There's reports of forced abortions. There's reports of invasive birth control. This is an attempt to wipe out the entire culture. This fits the definition.
Was absolutely chilling, John, when they talked about how students come back, Uyghur students come back home on break, and they say, "Where are my parents?" And Chinese officials issued this form response where they said, "Oh, your parents are at training centers, and they're under very good conditions, but you can't see them." I mean, that's just chilling.
I mean, this is like a movie. This is a dystopian novel. This is Hunger Games sorts of stuff, right? Yeah. I mean, and this is actually happening in the world. And this is an organization now, a movie studio. And by the way, this all is kind of connected to the way that they bowed down to China years ago in the 1990s, when they did a film that was pro Dalai Lama, and basically they were threatened to be kicked out. And you know what? Disney can't survive. I mean, well, they can survive, but they can't be as rich as they want to be if they don't have access to that many billions of people, and therefore billions of dollars. It's the same story with the NBA. It's the same story with that all these people that are virtualing these social justice causes, and these and the NBA, of course, if you've watched it in the bubble, it's just everywhere. In the playoffs, and since they've restarted the season, and they're just crystal clear on the justice issue there. But the intentional attempt to dismantle an entire people group's existence, this is still about money at the end of the day.
I seem to remember somebody at some point saying that the love of money is the root of all evil.
That sounds really smart. Somebody should write that down if they haven't already. But it is, and it's true corporately as well. I think this is, thankfully, this attention's going. And by the way, we do have some examples of people that are calling China out. China clearly thinks it can act with absolute impunity, right? That they think that they're a financial enough behemoth that they can get away with almost anything. India has pulled out of commerce there.
To a great extent, that's true. But as someone I read this week observed, John, it's going to be hard to divest from China or really make them sort of reconsider their actions on an economic level. But when is it going to be easier? Is it going to be easier in 20 years? Because China is ascendant right now.
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, it is. And I'm not sure we have another option other than, full-blown war other than complete financial divestiture. And you know what? It will hurt them. And that's what's so tragic is I'm not sure the way forward other than that complete financial separation. But of course, the people who are going to pay for that are the people on the ground there. And you know, the promise of economic stability and cultural safety, those two things have basically been the source of the authority and the power and the control for the Chinese government. And there are some definite cracks in that. I mean, Apple pulled out, you know, a lot of their manufacturing. India pulled out, although I think that's probably far more geopolitical than it is any sort of noble, you know, attempt to protect a persecuted minority. I think this is a decision that every Christian family should take very, very seriously about what it means to disconnect here. It's an awful, awful reality.
And we're going to keep covering this story as it develops, I'm sure, week by week, and as we have over the course of this year. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And this week, John, one of the stories that caught my attention and the attention of many people was an NPR interview with the author of a book called In Defense of Looting, a riotous history of uncivil action. And the author of this book is named Vicky Osterweil. And in this kind of puff piece interview, they give her the space to explain the case that she thinks she can make that violent rioting and looting is actually an expression of justice and a means to creating a better society. And there was this fantastic, I just finished reading this and I posted it on Facebook with a couple of quotes because it was so good, response to this interview by, is it Graham Wood? Is that how you say his name?
I think I just heard it Graham Wood, but I could be wrong.
Okay,
yeah, I don't know.
Graham Wood. Yeah, that shows how much I know about Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, if that's what it is. But the piece in the Atlantic is this blistering response to Osterweil's logic, and he basically points out that not only does the book on the back jacket have or inside next to the title page have a warning about not stealing the author's intellectual property, which is tremendously ironic. But her defense fails to take into account who's really hurt by rioting and looting. It's not the rich and the powerful capitalist pigs. It's just not. It is the mom and pop immigrant small business owners in these communities who have put their entire lives into these businesses, and for the sake of their kids have done this and are now watching it go up in smoke before them. And the point is that this kind of destructive activity is never helpful for the communities in which it takes place. And I think probably the most disturbing aspect to Osterweil's logic to me, John, was the attack on nonviolent protest and on the tactics of Martin Luther King Jr. in particular. She sort of grudgingly acknowledges him on some front, but ultimately paints him as having, and his tactics as having, gelded this movement for racial justice in the United States, and that which is incredibly inane when you actually look at what his movement accomplished and what actually came out of the civil rights movement, not just legislatively, but culturally. But this is an argument that's out there, that's being made, and Wood thinks that it's actually going to be counterproductive, that it'll end up backfiring and creating more critics of the idea of looting and defending looting on both the right and the left. And I think I'm inclined to agree with him. But what do you think? I mean, where does this land us? Do we really have a group of people in this country who are seriously defending violent rioting and looting?
Yeah, and we've had that forever on all kinds of sides, people that, justify lawlessness, but it's never a majority opinion. And I don't think it's in danger of becoming one in this case either. NPR has made a career of taking really bizarre, crazy, progressive causes and in their calm, soothing voice, making them sound quite reasonable. But I don't think in this case, this is going to make, consider it. I mean, in Portland, right? In Portland, they're now arresting rioters and protesters. The Democratic governors are going to support these protests like in ways until these things become violent and the destruction becomes too great, and people's lives are, I wish as soon as people's lives were at risk, but it can't be sustained in this way. So I don't think we're in danger of justified looting being elevated to any sort of, acceptable position, except, by some. I mean, to me, it falls into that category. I think it was Ravi Zacharias who once said that, some positions are so bizarre it takes a PhD to believe them. I think this probably is, it takes a good bit of privilege in order to talk about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Here's the thing that I think is worth maybe talking about is that the ideology or the worldview that would drive a book like this is clearly underscored in some sort of either totalitarian revolutionary framework if you're talking about injustice. And even if you go to most revolutionary causes in history, it would be a mixed bag, which one would justify the sort of kind of lawlessness as opposed to order. But critical theory, which is the hot topic of conversation, which basically divides the world into the oppressors and the oppressed. And those on the one side are the good guys, the oppressed, and those that are the oppressors are the bad guys. And that's it, conversation over. It's hard for me to imagine why someone who truly embraced the assumptions of this particular frame of reference, of the power dynamics and the injustice and how those injustices can be made right, would have any grounds whatsoever to disagree with this book, to disagree with the fact that looting itself is justified, right? Because the morality itself in that frame of reference is certainly not based on any universal standards, any ultimate senses of justice or morality. It's basically weighted in terms of which side you're on. And if you own a store, and I think you're right. I mean, my guess is even this author would not justify, somebody, in an impoverished neighborhood holding on barely to a local food shop being in the same category as, what we saw where basically Saks Fifth Avenue is just opening the door saying, hey, don't break the windows on the way in because they have insurance and it's not going to hurt them that bad, right? I mean, these are two completely different situations. My guess is the Defense of Looting book has the, Goldman Sachs or Saks Fifth Avenue. Sorry, I messed up that reference, didn't I? Saks Fifth Avenue in mind, not, not the mom and pop shop. But at the same time, it's hard for me to find any way that critical race theorists, if they're actually consistent, if they're actually top to bottom consistent of the assumptions of this sort of frame of reference, would have any grounds to disagree with this book.
Well, isn't it interesting, John, that critical race theory, and I don't know enough about critical race theory to say whether it is the exact cause of a lot of this violence and looting, or whether it's something more primal in human nature that just sort of, breaks out and takes advantage of situations.
But hold on. Doesn't that depend on whether you think that there's pure motivation here or not, right? So you have the protesters, some of whom are even violent. Yeah. Looting, however, do I think they've read the book on critical race theory? No, not at all. Right. But it's do you believe that there's something inherently sinful about human nature that will take opportunistic, chances like this in order to be personally enriched?
Yeah, and that's the interesting part, because when you see the criticism of nonviolent movements historically, and then this book is pointing to Martin Luther King Jr. in particular. Listen to what MLK Jr. said. His speeches and his writing were permeated with the language of Christianity. He was making an appeal as a Christian to a Christian people. Now we can get into what his personal life was like and so forth, and whether he was genuinely a believer. But the point is, he was speaking as a Christian, as a pastor, and his appeals were rooted in the Christian heart of the people that he assumed was there. The appeals being made now are on a completely different level, even by organizations like Black Lives Matter. I don't hear the same appeals to the common dignity that comes from the image of God in all of us, from the fact that we are dignified by the fact of the incarnation, by Jesus becoming man and dying for his his brethren, I hear something that sounds a lot more like the French Revolution, where religion itself is cast aside, and there's this bald assertion of rights. We don't know where they come from. We don't know who handed them down, and we can't really even give you a complete list of what they are right now. But there's some rights out there, and we think they're self-evident, and we think that they're accessible via reason. But of course, we saw where that degenerated into, where setting up a temple of reason ended up becoming the site for the one of the greatest slaughters in
what's the great line? Man will never be free until the last king is strangled by the entrails of the last priest. Who was that? Was that
maybe Robespierre? I could be wrong.
Yeah, just classic line. Yeah.
Who didn't he end up falling to the revolution as well in the end?
Oh, that's it. I mean, it's kind of like hyper, KJV only fundamentalism. Pretty soon you find yourself all alone. No, you do. God. I mean, I wasn't trying to be sarcastic here. Yeah. Certainly you don't kill anybody. But I mean, no, this is the story of the late 20th century where no one's pure enough. And so then everyone becomes the enemy. And by the way, haven't we seen that already on college campuses where, progressive left-leaning professors who are and the whole list that signed the Harper's letter a few weeks ago, that these all count. But I want to go back to your Martin Luther King reference, because not only did he appeal to God, and not only did he appeal to the common humanity that we all share, and therefore you are guilty of leaving a whole segment of the population of which I'm a part out of that dignity. But he also appealed to universal moral standards to recognize injustice, right? So in other words, this is unjust. How do we know it's unjust? Because there are universal standards. And yes, it's legal, but these laws are unjust because there's something higher than the law, right? That then we can use to adjudicate these things. Your line earlier that there's no appeal to any sort of universal standard, right? By whose standard then are we saying this is right, this is wrong? And this is my point about critical theory. Critical theory doesn't appeal to any of those standards either. It just appeals to oppressor dynamics. It appeals to power. Everything is understood through these power dynamics, and the only solution is a new power dynamic. There's no getting closer to justice because there's no justice to get closer to. And that's, I guess, my point. I don't think these writers have read a single book on this. I don't, maybe some have, maybe some haven't. I think it's in the universities. I do think it's certainly in critical race theories in the universities and so on. And I want to say critical theory, because critical race theory, by the way, is just this version. And I said this earlier this week on a couple different places.
Critical theory is the ice cream shop. Critical race theory is
it's a flavor
butterscotch.
Right now. Yeah, that's right. But look, I think there's going to be plenty of people that are really upset. We might see something along the lines of the internal war between the L and the G and the T's, right? When the next version of this is critical queer theory, in which a group of people based on a lifestyle choice is completely culturally appropriating all the suffering and discrimination and injustice that the African American population has dealt with, for so long. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we saw
the same
if there's
thing
going to
be an internal conflict
in the prior iteration of the LGBT movement. It was
they've hijacked it. This is just the latest thing, but critical theory now has become the unquestionable theory of everything, right? Like this is the explanation. You don't see any institutions of cultural power right now questioning it whatsoever. It's moved into the unquestionable category.
Yeah, and you made a comparison sorry to interrupt. You made a comparison. I really want to make sure we get to this in the editorial meeting earlier this week. That was perfect, between conspiracy theories, which function as theories of everything, like we said last week, and critical race theory, or critical theory in general, which functions as almost a conspiratorial theory of everything. There's the same sort of flavor to it.
Right. And I think, and there's some people that I actually respect greatly who have been asking the question, look, can we just take critical theory seriously as an analytical tool? Like that's all it is, especially some Christians that are trying to use it. Here's where I disagree. It's not an analytical tool. It's a theory of everything. It's built on a theory of everything. It's kind of like saying, can we just have communism without the Marxist worldview under? Sorry, communism's not a theory of economics. Communism is a theory of everything. Everything can be boiled down to these categories. Or somebody saying, hey, can I have just the the blonder hair without the whole eugenics going along with it. It's like, sorry, eugenics is a theory of everything. It doesn't just give you a new look for the human race. It gives you a theory of everything, and critical theory is that. And there's no observation right now coming out of critical theory that is not available in terms of analyzing the problem, that's not first available in our thought about what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, and the history of this that comes from Christian theology. Now, I also want to say this because it came up earlier too. By the way, if you want some more thoughts on critical theory and so on, we have a set of videos called "What Would You Say?" and there's a couple of videos about this, so we'll link those in the show notes. But the other thing I wanted to say is simply that one of the critiques that I think we need to take seriously is by those who are saying, you're spending all your time critiquing critical theory and not enough time dealing with the actual injustice. The fact that injustice exists is not an excuse for using a bad framework to deal with it. But we have no excuse as Christians to not stand up for the inherent dignity of every single person and to fight whatever injustice we see. We have enough heroes throughout history that have led the way from all races and creeds and gender. I was going to say genders. There's only two for the record, but they're from both of them.
You're just so used to reading that in the boilerplate on articles nowadays that it just popped into your head naturally.
All genders, which are two. I'm going to start saying that. It's like all genders are accepted here, which are two. Yeah, that's the language. But anyway, you see what I mean. Christians should be at the forefront of proposing a solution or solutions or reconciliations, not just in critiquing what is it's a bad theory. It's a theory of everything. It fails.
It's groundless. And to the extent that it is rooted in Marxism, the Marxist tradition is one that is, despite its vaunts to having been a very scientific, analytical, economic theory, it's really a moral theory. It's really a demand for moral justice and economic justice, and it's been sort of adapted into a racial context here. But the same thing applies. It's a cry for justice, but that's completely baseless. And its techniques don't work either, by the way. So that's why Christians are in a fantastic spot to offer an alternative that answers that cry for justice, that very real and right cry for justice, with the conception of justice that's rooted in the very nature of God and in the likeness that he implanted in human beings.
Amen.
We're here on Breakpoint this week in the extended segment for the online podcast. And there's another story that I really wanted to hit this week that we dealt with on the Breakpoint commentary, John. And I think it was one of the best commentaries that we've done in some time here because of the way it drew out the deep worldview question that's at the root of a story, a very horrific but also encouraging story that came out in the past couple of weeks. It's about the trafficking of children. In just the past 2 months, authorities in Michigan, Ohio, and Georgia have rescued 58 children ranging in age from 3 to 17 who were either missing who were victims of sex trafficking. And in addition to the children who were rescued, the officials managed to nab more than 24 predators in the process. But, I think what struck me about this commentary so much, John, was how you noted the great news that these guys have been caught, the horrifying nature of their crimes and what was going on there underneath people's noses. In what I would think of as sort of Bible Belt states, whether in the South or in the North there, which is so weird. And then, but the attention immediately turned to the hypocrisy of our culture, where on the one hand we're disgusted rightly with human trafficking and finding it in our midst here, but on the other hand, our culture is. At least part of our culture is open to things like Netflix's new Cuties movie, which we talked about recently on this program and on Breakpoint, where you've got this a girl who decides to join a twerking troupe out of a Muslim context and defy her parents' traditions and morals, and then starts wearing skimpy outfits and dancing in sexual ways for adults. This is an 11-year-old girl in this movie. And the schizophrenia here, the cognitive dissonance is just staggering to me, that we want to condemn the sexualization of children on one hand, and then we've got one of the biggest entertainment companies in the world and certainly in this country, glorifying it in a piece of entertainment, in a movie, as something we can watch and enjoy and sort of brush off as entertainment. Do we not see that we're feeding exactly the desires that create the demand for trafficking of children?
You know, that sort of schizophrenia or worldview schizophrenia is even present in the person who created and directed that film. Netflix has no excuse for the commercial that they chose, for the video they chose, for the printed ad that they chose. The director, though, was quoted this week or last week or late last week when challenged by all the controversy, saying, you know, I saw this when I was, you know, she was somewhere. She actually saw this sort of dance competition live. And she tells a little bit of the story. I don't remember the details, but it so horrified her that she wanted to bring it to light. And so she brings it to light with this film. But she brings it to light, admittedly, in the film without ever making a moral judgment about it, about the behavior of these girls. So again, where are we? We're at a place of complete schizophrenia where our outrage, which we feel against the sexualization of children, is now without any sort of undergirding whatsoever. It's without any sort of ideological or moral foundations whatsoever, because we've told kids that sexual autonomy is the source of their dignity. We've told kids that they can do and be and think and whatever they feel is absolutely true. We told, you know, parents, you know, that we need to teach kids as young as whatever about gender expression and gender identity, and that they need to have an education as early as junior high on the ins and outs of you know, sexual behavior of all kinds. You know, we've gone from a 90210 where it was kind of this kind of edgy, risky talk about maybe having sex in high school, to Glee, where they not only talked about it, but they did it. And it wasn't in LA, it was in central Indiana. So the very fact that this producer is defending her work when she, A, knows it's going to be used by pedophiles and perverts in a sexualized way, B, she's sexualizing girls to complain about sexualizing girls. And see, she doesn't make any moral judgments about it. But to think that that's the role of an artist, that, you know, so you get two things here. What is the role of art? What is art itself supposed to do? And do we have any moral framework to operate on in any way? I mean, look, I've been using this example for years, for at least a couple of years now, because I remember feeling it. I remember Hugh Hefner died and listening to all the fawning and what a great person he was and how much he championed women's rights. And and he was a civil rights champion because, you know, he was willing to put African-American young ladies on the cover of his girly mag 2.
That and then just was pure whiplash. It was pure whiplash.
And then Harvey Weinstein was 3 weeks later. Literally, right. I actually looked it up the other day because I didn't remember if I remembered it right. But it was when those first accusations, then they, you know, there was a moment when there was that kind of incredible article. Was it the New Yorker or the New York Times that put this out? And then, and of course, everybody already knew about Harvey Weinstein anyway. I mean, The Simpsons had done shows, I think, you know, joking about it, or South Park, or one of those.
Celebrities joked about it at award shows.
Oh, literally. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the schizophrenia, the inconsistency is stunning. Now, what does that tell us, though? That sort of inconsistency can't go on forever. So we can call it out, and I think we should. But, you know, a culture cannot build and sustain itself on this kind of sexual confusion. Sexuality is too inherently connected with who we are as human beings, too inherently connected who we are as male and female, too inherently connected to the foundational building blocks of family, of society, and so on. So we're basically seeing a culture exhaust itself sexually, run out of steam. We've seen this movie before. It's, you know, it happened in Rome. It happened, Patiram Sorokin, a Harvard sociologist, walks through all the cultures in which this took place. When a culture sexually exhausts itself, it can't build for the future. We're seeing these kind of, they're not last gasps, but they're dying gasps, I think, of a civilization that won't have a future this way.
And it's tremendously privileged as well for a secular culture to try and say that we can have this one barrier against sexual abuse, consent, at a certain age, and then everything will just be fine. It's privileged because they're running off the steam of a Christian civilization. They're still running off of the moral revulsion that's hanging on as a vestige of Christianity. But that moral revulsion is not going to be there forever, John. It's not historically odd for men to prey on children. If anything, it's the historical norm, and
Right.
Christianity changed that. So I mean, we get, we always were criticized, conservatives were always criticized for using the slippery slope argument, but I think it's pretty well established by this phase in the sexual revolution that the slippery slope argument is really just a roadmap of the future at this point. And I would say expect in the next few years, not too long, for there to be a very serious, not just academic, but maybe even popular debate over the issue of whether minors are really off limits when it comes to consenting for sex. Do they really have no sexual agency? Because that's just a sort of covenant that we've made as a society, that no one under 18 really has sexual agency that they can exercise with adults. But
we've completely decided they have sexual agency and exercising with each other.
Right. And that's nonsensical. So unless your sexual ethic is rooted in a moral complex that has much more to do with natural law and the image of God and the purpose of sex, teleology, unless it's rooted in that, as the Christian ethic is, it won't stand. Just this consent only ethic is going to fall apart very quickly.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, it's time for our recommendation segment here, where John and I give recommendations for books and films and movies and videos and just cool stuff that we've encountered over the course of the week that's edifying and helpful for living and thinking like a Christian. And my recommendation this week, John, is going to be music. Last week, we kind of concentrated on movies and videos. I want to talk about some music real briefly here. I want to recommend the work of the Grey Havens. I'm going to interview them, actually, David and Leisha Radford, next week for Upstream. So that episode will be coming out pretty shortly. Stay on the lookout for that. But I think these two really balance, and it's a husband and wife duo. They balance really excellent kind of folksy indie sounding music that's lyrically excellent with the deeper message that's not too on the nose. And the reason I say that is because Christian music, and these are Christian artists, Christian music is very often so on the nose that it sacrifices artistic excellence or lyrical excellence. And even sometimes it'll be musically good, but it's just, it just punches you right in the face with an explicit Christian message that has no, it has no flourish. It has no artistic value. The Grey Havens have really mastered, I think, that artistic flourish where they bring you into a story with their lyrics and then help you see the beauty of what they're saying. And so now, full disclosure, some of their songs, I'm not sure exactly what they're saying. And I do plan to ask about some of them because some of them are pretty esoteric, but there's other songs like This My Soul, which is the most incredible unpacking of the role that Adam and Christ play in redemptive history, where in the first Adam, what this man has done, it all extends to you. And then they talk about how the curse is a result of his fall and how we all are affected by that. We all die. But then Christ comes on the scene in the last verse, and he takes the curse of Eden on himself and he lives a righteous life. And then it says, this, my soul, you were born into what this man has done. It all extends to you. And so he's the new Adam, he occupies that covenantal role in our lives. And then songs like Band of Gold, where they glorify marriage and the permanence of it, and kind of symbolized by the endless eternal nature of that wedding ring loop. And it's just really cool to see them, singing together, see them writing together. And I know it's been a weird year for all musicians because the touring scene has completely collapsed. So I want to recommend their music, really like them, and be sure to catch my conversation with them on Upstream.
I want to, my recommendation this week is a new book by someone who I think is doing something really innovative in fighting evil. And I think this is an approach that Christians can take, and we need to start thinking about everything that we said just a minute ago about the sexualization of children and the inconsistency of the late sexual revolution and the mixed messages for kids and everything else that we just talked about. Katy Faust runs an organization called Them Before Us. You can find them at, I think, thembeforeus.org. But her new book, Them Before Us, is entitled Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. I was talking this week to the head of a large association and that represents works with families and students and so on. And I pitched this idea to him and said, we need to start thinking about how we can talk about the LGBT sorts of issues, the no fault divorce sorts of issues, the pornography, this kind of weak, flimsy category of consent and everything else, not just in terms of morality, which I think we've done a lot of, but to basically say, look, the perpetual myth of the sexual revolution has always been the kids will be fine, and at every turn they haven't been. So at some right, when are we going to put children's rights ahead of adult happiness? Because we've spent the last 40 years putting adult happiness ahead of children's rights and treating children essentially like a puppy that we want to have when we want to have it, and so on and so on and so on. In so many ways. And I think Katy has been bringing that message. Helen Alvarez, by the way, George Mason, scholar at George Mason, has written a very academic book along these lines. That's, first of all, it's a couple $100, and second, it's very high level written. The book by Katy Faust and Stacey Manning, the foreword's written by Professor Robbie George. I think it's a very important approach. And what I'd love to see is for pastors to start thinking, how can I talk about these issues through the language of children's rights, and school teachers and moms and dads and grandparents, what's right for the kids, and to start rebuilding that, I think is a strategic and biblical win. And so I want to recommend that book, Them Before Us. You can find it on Amazon. You can come to our bookstore and find it. And I think it's a tremendous book.
Isn't that very much along the lines of Mary Eberstadt's book, Primal Screams?
Mary Eberstadt, and we can link at the show notes to the interview that I did with her years ago or months ago about her book. It's more generalized than that, but she definitely hits the children's rights angles in the middle of it. She also hits all kinds of other things. It's more in line of all the victims of the sexual revolution. If you go to Them Before Us, the website, there's just stories there. In fact, Katy's first kind of came into the public eye when she wrote an article years ago for Public Discourse saying, I love my 2 lesbian moms, but I wish I had a dad.
Wow.
And, she wasn't trying to throw anybody under the bus. It was very, very clear what, she had a good relationship with her mom, still does, as I understand it, has a good relationship with her mom's, lesbian, longest lesbian partner when she was growing up as a friend, but it's not the same. Because as Ryan Anderson said, and I'm going to be doing, by the way, by the time this airs, I will have just done a town hall meeting with Ryan and with some others talking about the recent Supreme Court decisions and kind of what we can expect. But Ryan likes to say, there's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering, but parenting's just the name. In every indication, biblically, biologically, sociologically, relationally, moms don't dad and dads don't mom. And the kids need both. And the deeper question is, even if you don't believe in God, biology has given kids both. So to deny these basic realities that kids need. So anyway, yeah, I think there's a lot of white space left to be innovative and apply this to the arts, to the sciences, to education, to religious education, to parenting and grandparenting. I think this is one of those pegs that we could hang an awful lot of really helpful cultural renewing things on.
Come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that John and I have mentioned today on the show. And we'll also link you there to daily worldview commentary and resources to help you think and live like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.